Okay, so it's 6 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Heather Bobrowitz, and I am the programming librarian here at STC Library, and I am honored today to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Judy Tzu-chun Wu. So Dr. Wu is a professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of California, Irvine. She is also Associate Dean of Research, Faculty Development, and Public Engagement in the School of Humanities, the Director of the Humanities Center, and the Director of the Center for Liberation, Anti-Racism, and Belonging, also known as the C-Lab. She specializes in Asian American immigration, comparative racialization, women's gender and sexuality histories. Dr. Wu received her PhD in U.S. history from Stanford University and previously taught at Ohio State University. She authored Dr. Mom Chung of the Fair-Haired Bastards, The Life of a Wartime Celebrity in 2005, and Radicals on the Road, Internationalism, Orientalism, and Feminism During the Vietnam Era in 2013. Her recent book, Fierce and Fearless, Patsy Takemoto Mink, First Woman of Color in Congress, was published in 2022 and is a collaboration with political scientist Gwendolyn Mink. Dr. Wu is currently working on a book that focuses on Asian American and Pacific Islander women who attended the 1977 National Women's Conference and co-editing Unequal Sisters, the 5th edition, and Women and Social Movements in the United States from 1600 to 2000. She also serves in the editorial committee for the University of California Press and as a series editor for the U.S. in the World series with Cornell University Press. She is the co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. So she is an incredibly busy lady. And we are very honored for her to share her time with us today and tell us all about Patsy Takemoto Mink, who was fierce and fearless. So I will let you take it away, Dr. Wu.
Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction and for arranging this talk for me. I'll thank Sally Hanchett with the Organization of American Historians who facilitated this introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint on my work on Patsy Mink. And let's see if we can get this going. I was also going to share that I went to a Title IX conference just on Tuesday, and it was really amazing. Patsy Mink co-authored Title IX, and Title IX has been renamed after her. And the conference that was held in Bakersfield attracted coaches, athletes, people like Cheryl Miller, these incredible women who've spent all their lives dedicated to pushing themselves to excel in sports and mentoring other women and young girls to be in sports. So it was an honor to be there and share my research about the women who helped provide the legislative mandate for these advances for women. I want to just acknowledge my co-author, Gwendolyn Mink, who is Patsy Mink's daughter. When I began this project, everybody said, we need to go meet Wendy Mink. She actually lives in the condominium that her parents lived in when they were living in Washington, D.C. I would do a lot of my research as a Library of Congress and just walk down the street and go visit her afterwards. It was great to be able to share what I was finding in the archive. So these are letters and memos, newspaper accounts from the time period. And then to be able to talk to someone who lived through that period with her parents and to find out the inside scoop about what was happening in their family. So I just wanted to acknowledge Wendy as my co-author. I'd like to begin just by sharing some information about Patsy Takemoto Mink. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know who she is. She was the first Japanese American female lawyer in Hawaii. And given the racial demographics in the United States, most likely she was the first in the continental United States as well. She was the first woman of color to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, the first woman of color in Congress. Many people think that it was Shirley Chisholm, who's African-American, that Patsy Mink was actually elected 4 years before Chisholm. And they shared a lot of similar political interests and were political allies with each other. But Patsy Mink was actually the first. As I mentioned before, she's a co-author, a defender of Title IX. And what I think is really interesting about Title IX, and I can talk more when there's maybe during the Q&A session, is that when it was first passed, Title IX mandates gender equity in schools that receive federal funding. And when it was first passed, it wasn't necessarily intended for sports. It was really all aspects of education. So about admissions, scholarship, housing, employment, the climate, whether women were facing sexual harassment. And so sports was actually something of almost an afterthought. And after Title IX was passed, the athletic lobbies and the coaches became concerned that Title IX would mandate more equitable spending and resources between male and female sports. And so then they became really engaged in lobbying against Title IX to try to dilute it. And Patsy Mink played a really important role in defending Title IX against this onslaught of criticism. She also ran for the US presidency in 1972, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. That's the same year that Shirley Chisholm also ran, but because they were political allies and supporters of one another, they actually agreed not to directly compete with one another in their presidential campaigns. I'd like to take a step back now that you know a little bit about Patsy Mink to think, well, how can she be historically and popularly recognized as a feminist leader? Is that a challenge to the way that we tend to think about history? And here I want to bring up the representation of Asian Americans as model minorities. This representation suggests that Asian Americans work hard, that they have strong families, that they achieve educational success and economic success, and that their hard work in many ways demonstrates that America, the United States as a society is functioning, that it really requires more individual effort as opposed to structural transformation. And I want to point out that this representation of Asian Americans appeared in the mid-1960s. Actually, around the time that Mink was elected to Congress, 1964, she entered Congress in 1965. That's where a lot of the publicity about Asian Americans as model minorities appeared. But I want to mention that this is very much a media construct, because you actually look at where Asian Americans were living at that time, the socioeconomic conditions that they experienced, the racial obstacles that they experienced. For example, someplace like San Francisco, Chinatown, had the highest residential density in the country, even higher than Manhattan. There's very limited green space. There were high incidence of tuberculosis. And so people in the community were actually advocating for higher wages, better working conditions, better living conditions. They were engaging in social political movement protest inspired by the civil rights movement. But in terms of the popular representation, they were seen as a solution to the civil rights movement, seen as a criticism of the civil rights movement, that there were mass movements trying to structurally critique the United States, as opposed to just working hard and getting ahead. For Asian American women in particular, there's not only the representation of them being model minorities, but there's also the assumption that they are exotic, erotic, that they are here to please those in power. And this is a representation that Asian American women like Patsy Mink herself faced. So one newspaper recounted that when she went to a national political convention, the newspaper reporter described her almost like a beauty pageant contestant. They asked her about her measurements. They described how beautiful she was. There wasn't very much coverage of her actual political views. And this is something that was repeated in other media formats. For example, when she gave a speech at the 1960 National Democratic Convention on behalf of civil rights, one of the local commentators just said, "Oh, isn't she so cute? She's so small, and so she's so tiny. She's like an Oriental doll." When she was elected to Congress, she appeared on a number of media outlets and was invited to perform hula on national television. So if you can imagine a white male politician being asked to perform a dance as an expression of his identity, it's really unthinkable. But it was something that was thinkable and was expected of someone who was Asian American, female, and especially from someone who's coming from the state of Hawaii. I think Patsy Mink also not only challenges these popular racial and gender representations, but she also challenges the way that we tend to think about the history of feminism in this country. So typically there's a waves analogy of feminism. The first wave are the various political movements that emerged in the 19th century and culminates with the passage of the 19th Amendment and the obtainment of women's suffrage. The second wave is also associated with the 50s, 60s, and 70s, women who became involved with the civil rights movement, with the anti-war movement, and eventually formed their own movement to name sexism, to name patriarchy, to find different ways to overcome sexism. And the third wave, usually dated to the 1990s, is associated much more with intersectional feminism. So thinking about women's oppression in conjunction with other forms of inequality, whether it's racial, class, ability, disability, and so on. So Patsy Mink seems like an anomaly in many ways because she emerges in the 1960s and her political career actually spans until 2002 when she passed away. But she was in Congress, and a lot of the political movements of the 60s, 70s were much more grassroots in orientation. So that phrase, the personal is political, refers to these small consciousness-raising groups that women form to talk about their everyday issues and to use that as a basis to name structural forms of hierarchy. But Mink was in Congress. She was, making law. She was making policy. And there was also a tendency to talk about the second wave in different political ideologies. So someone like Patsy Mink might be described as a liberal feminist, not necessarily politically liberal, although she was, but that she was somebody who worked within the system. She was focused on trying to obtain equal rights for women. She was interested in political opportunities, economic opportunities. So there's a way in which she might be pigeonholed, even though she was somewhat unexpected because she was an Asian American woman. But I'm trying to use Patsy Mink as a way to perhaps broaden our understanding of what feminism is or has been in this country. And I'll give you some examples of how she does that. And as a way to introduce how she, in many ways, breaks the mold or perhaps challenges some more rigid categories about feminism, I want to refer to the work of Shayla Sandoval, who is a Latinx feminist thinker. And she talks about how women of color feminists tend to operate through a differential consciousness that refuses any singular approach to resist multiple intersecting oppressions. So what does that mean? Instead of just pigeonholing somebody to being a liberal feminist or working within the system, to think about women of color actually adopting different ideologies, different strategies, and fundamentally, they're trying to achieve greater justice. And so instead of trying to categorize people within a certain political approach, that we might want to think much more expansively about someone like Patsy Mink, her political career. So let me transition to the three main ideas that I introduced in the book, Fierce and Fearless. And one of the first ideas I talk about is Patsy Mink being a bridge feminist. And this is not my term. Other scholars have used this to describe people like Shirley Chisholm, who are bridging formal politics and grassroots politics, bridging between the civil rights movement and the women's movement. And this is what I see Patsy Mink doing, that she's not just someone who's isolated or exceptional working on Capitol Hill, but she's in dialogue with various political movements and trying to figure out ways to translate the analyses that people are developing in response to their everyday lives and providing a voice for those ideas and translating those ideas into policy. The first example I want to give you is actually her activism on behalf of trying to end the war in Vietnam. Some pretty shocking statistics that I tend to refer to when I talk about the war in Vietnam is that if you take all the bombs that were dropped in the United States, or dropped by the United States during World War II, which is a global war, if you take all the bombs that were dropped by the United States and you triple that, that's how much was dropped on Vietnam, which is a relatively small country. And I think what else is really surprising is that 2/3 of those bombs were dropped on South Vietnam, which is the US ally. Why is the United States bombing its own ally? There's a famous quote by US military personnel who said, in order to save it, we had to destroy it. In order to save this village from communism, we had to destroy it. And unfortunately, that was the way in which the United States fought the war. In addition to the amount of bombing that occurred, the war was often fought with guerrilla fighters. And so it was hard to measure the success of the war purely in terms of geography, like how much the United States and the South Vietnamese troops took over versus the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, because they were going back and forth between the same land. And so oftentimes what we used was the idea of body counts. And that's what was being reported in these nice nightly news accounts. How many people were killed, how many Americans were killed, how many Vietnamese people were killed. And various scholars have talked about how the numbers for the Vietnamese were inflated. In fact, someone said, if it's Vietnamese and dead, then we label that person as a VC, as a Viet Cong, as an enemy. Patsy Mink was very concerned about the impact of the war, and I apologize if some of the terminology is offensive or triggering. But in the aftermath of the My Lai massacre, in which US troops entered a village which they had misidentified as a stronghold of VC, the Viet Cong, the enemy, and had killed almost everybody in that village, about 500 people. But in the aftermath of that, Patsy Mink talked about how there was a, quote, mere gook rule within the US military that seemed to presume that life was less valuable, less important for someone who was of Asian background. I've had a chance to visit that particular village, and there's some very moving memorials there. There's plaques put up where former homes were. And so you can see within the family if there was a grandparent who was killed or a baby who was killed. And this was very much an act of genocide, basically, by the US military. And actually, even after it happened, it took a number of years before this was exposed. And there was some attempt to bring accountability to the people who enacted the violence. But President Nixon actually pardoned the primary person who was seen as the instigator of the violence, although there were other people who participated, and allowed that person to just live within house arrest. And so this whole episode really illuminated the ways in which the war was fought in a way that racialized Vietnamese people of racialized people of Asian ancestry, that the conflict reinforced these racial divides that presumed that Asian lives were less valuable. This was a critique that was being made, not just by Patsy Mink, but by Asian Americans involved in the anti-war movement. And their critique was different from, for example, the mainstream anti-war movement, which might have said, bring our troops back home, let's protect American lives. And for Asian Americans who had an identification with the people in Southeast Asia, they're saying we need to protect the lives not only of Americans, but also of people who are being bombed, who are being killed in Southeast Asia. Another aspect of Mink's argument about the war is that she connected it, the Vietnam War with other wars that the United States engaged in, and very specifically World War II, the ways in which Japanese Americans in the United States were presumed to be the enemy of the United States, regardless of citizenship, regardless of actual individual acts. There was wholesale removal of Japanese Americans who lived on the West Coast of the United States, not based on individual action or guilt, but because of race. And so she points out that what was happening in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s was very similar to what was happening in the United States during the 1940s. In addition to making these critiques, which were in line with the Asian American anti-war movement and with the Asian American movement in general, she was also very much connected with the women's movement. Here's a picture of Patsy Mink and Bella Abzug, who entered Congress, and they were best friends. Sometimes they would often sit next to each other. Sometimes they would even dress together with similar styles, with the polka dots and the big hats. And Bella Abzug came from an organization called Women's Strike for Peace. Now, Abzug herself was a lawyer, was a labor activist, but she participated in this organization, Women's Strike for Peace, that in many ways utilized a very traditional understanding of gender roles, women as mothers, women as housewives, and argued that women should play a role in international diplomacy, that they had a vested interest in stopping nuclear proliferation, that they had a vested interest in promoting peace, that they wanted to not just save their children, but they wanted to save other people's children as well. And Mink and Abzug arranged to travel to Paris in 1972 to meet with Madame Nguyen Thi Binh. Madame Nguyen Thi Binh is arguably the most recognizable Vietnamese woman during that time period. She was part of the Paris Peace Accord negotiations. She was the only woman that was part of the Paris Peace Accord negotiations. She was also frequently a host and a contact for anti-war activists around the world who were interested in learning more about the impact of the war on Vietnam. And so you see here this moment where you have three women who are all political leaders trying to have dialogue, trying to figure out ways in which they might come to a better resolution than just continuing the war. And it's this anti-war advocacy that actually led Patsy Mink to run for the US presidency in 1972. Some anti-war activists in Oregon decided that she would be an ideal candidate for making a strong case as to why the war needed to end. And Patsy Mink worked very hard. She campaigned up and down the state, which did not have the significant Asian American population. She didn't get very far in terms of her campaign. But I think what it expresses is that she felt that she had the right to run, and that she wanted to take the opportunity to amplify her political views, and that she was not going to kind of be cowed or be discouraged by the fact that other women have not succeeded in a presidential campaign. So this is my first idea, to think about Patsy Mink as a bridge feminist, connecting what she's doing in Congress with political movements. The second idea I want to introduce to you is Patsy Mink as someone who is thinking intersectionally in developing legislation. I mentioned intersectionality before. I just want to introduce Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal theorist, a critical race theorist, one of the founding thinkers of that particular intellectual movement. And she talks about the need to think about gender in a very complex, nuanced ways, not just thinking about gender as a divide between men and women, but to think about other forms of identities and social hierarchies that shape what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. So race, class, ability, and so on. And it's interesting to think about a legislator being intersectional, because law is supposed to be universal, right? You're supposed to apply the law to everybody. But I really believe that Patsy Mink, because of who she is and where she came from, that she was highly attuned to the ways in which multiple forms of oppression intersect with each other. And so she was really thinking about how to design legislation to respond to those concerns. So one example of this is that her advocacy for early childhood education for federally funded childcare. And these statistics give you a sense of how great the need was, that in late 60s, mid to late 60s, there were 4 million working mothers with children under the age of 6, but there were only at most 350,000 slots of childcare available. So for these women who either needed to work for financial reasons or wanted to work because they had aspirations beyond being a mother, there were very limited resources to make sure that their children were safe, that they were being taken care of, and that their minds were being nurtured intellectually and socially. This is something that Patsy Mink was highly aware of, the lack of childcare, and part of that has to do with history. So you have this picture here of the Plantation Society in Hawaii. Hawaii had been a Native Hawaiian kingdom. The United States occupied and took over the islands, instituted an economic system that basically was creating cash crops for export. So they initially tried to utilize Native Hawaiian laborers, but they were not interested in engaging in this transformation of their society. And so the United States imported workers from around the world, especially from Asia, but also Puerto Rico, Portugal, and other parts of the world. Because it's a plantation society, they wanted a stationary labor force. And this is in contrast to the West Coast of the United States, which also imported a lot of laborers. And there, they wanted workers to be mobile. They wanted to be able to follow the crops, employ them for different seasons, different products. But in the plantation society, they really wanted people to stay put. And so one of the strategies that plantation owners utilized was to import women, because they wanted to make sure that the men might be able to form families, form attachments. They thought that women could be a domesticating influence on them. They might not drink as much, they may not gamble as much, maybe not frequent prostitution as much. So even though these women in many ways were idealized for what they can do to like bring a gentler presence to plantation societies, they were expected to work as well. So you see these female work gangs. Women were paid less than men. And after they finished working in the fields, these long, grueling days, they would do another round of work because they would cook and they would clean and they would mend and sew and do laundry. And they would do this not only for themselves, but also for other men who didn't actually have women members of the households there. There was no childcare, there was no paid maternity leave. And this actually motivated the labor movement in Hawaii to make some of those demands. So women worked until they gave birth, and after they give birth, they came back to work as soon as possible. There was, for childcare, they might have older siblings take care of younger ones, or there might be an older, maybe an elderly grandmother who might take care of children. But it was not an ideal situation. These plantations that grew sugarcane, the sugar would grow taller than people. And then at the end, they would burn the sugar cane in order to process it. So you just can imagine the dangers for young children who are in that type of environment. This is something that Patsy Mink herself recognized because she grew up on the plantations, but also she herself faced this. She had wanted to become a doctor. That was her aspiration early on in her life. But she applied in the aftermath of World War II, when the GI Bill gave benefits to US veterans, which at the time were men. And there were also racial obstacles for non-white men to necessarily access some of those benefits. So when she was applying to medical school, even though she had good grades and had extracurriculars and all this interest in medicine, she was turned down by every single school that she applied to. It was a situation where very few women could actually get into medical school, and those slots were seen as the rightful opportunities for men who are returning from war. She decided to go to law school, and she received her training from a pretty elite law school, University of Chicago Law School. But when she graduated, she was only 2 women in her class, only 2 Asian Americans in her class, again, a double minority. She could not find a job. She worked at the libraries. She worked in a department store. She eventually came back to Hawaii and just decided to hang a shingle and start her own private business. And just to give you a sense of her clientele, her first client paid her with a fish, right? This kind of bargaining economy. And as she became a lawyer and as she became interested in politics, she had to find a way to a place for her daughter, who was my co-author, Wendy. So you see here, Patsy, her husband, John Mink, they met at the University of Chicago, and that's Wendy when she was very young. And they were very frustrated by the childcare that was available. They sent Wendy to a church-based childcare for a period of time. But Wendy came back with all these ideas about what girls can do and what boys could do. That she was getting inculcated in these very traditional understandings of gender. And that's not what Patsy Mink wanted for her daughter. When Mink was actually elected to Congress in the mid-60s, by then Wendy was in middle school, junior high, and she would just after school go down to the halls of Congress and see how legislators made law. So that was kind of their childcare by then. I wanted to just share this quote, which I think is so powerful, and it really illustrates the importance of law in helping to change the way we value change what we value. So here's Patsy Mink saying, the value of federal legislation, as others before me have pointed out, is not only that it provides a specific program and specific amount of money. And that was very important because as soon as she passed the legislation, as soon as there was funding allocated, she would contact various groups and say, okay, this is now available. You should apply for these funds. This will support the work that you want to do, right? But beyond that, it represents a national statement of purpose and support. It provides the inspiration for action and leadership at other levels of government, thus having an effect far beyond the simple provisions of law themselves. Right? That this is about a fundamental shift in what we value as a country, and that if these principles can be instilled in the national law, that it could inspire change at other levels of government, and hopefully it would inspire change in terms of private behavior as well. So this is the second example of intersectional legislative feminism. And here, Patsy Mink, in thinking about childcare, she's thinking about gender, she's thinking about class, she's thinking about labor. And the final idea I want to introduce to you is how Patsy Mink's location in the Pacific shaped her political ideas and vision. And I wanted to give you an example of how Patsy Mink advocated against nuclear testing and against militarism in the Pacific more broadly. During the Cold War, for a period of time, the United States was testing nuclear weapons in the open air and open water. And this occurred at different parts of the country, but one of the sites that was heavily used was the trust territories of the United States. Now, it became a trust territory of the United States because the United Nations recognized the United States as having special rights, privileges of taking care of those particular islands, and this includes the Marshall Islands. But the United States was conducting nuclear testing, and scholars have pointed out that the amount of testing that occurred was equivalent of one Hiroshima-sized bomb every day for 19 years. And this was not done with medical consent. Some people were relocated, but not far enough. And you can imagine the radioactivity that lasts decades, centuries, that it still continues to have an impact on those islands, those waters, and those individuals. I wanted to speak specifically, Mink was both concerned about those forms of testing that were happening in the Pacific, but I want to speak very specifically about a series of protests and tests that occurred off the shore of the Bering, or as part of the Bering Strait in Alaska, and namely on an island called Amchitka. From 1965, 1967, and 1971, there was a series of 3 tests that were held there. And by then, the United States had engaged in international agreements that we could not test, that we will not test in open air and open water because that was so highly contaminating. So instead, the United States dug a very deep well in Amchitka and exploded nuclear weapons, the largest of which was in 1971. So you have this 5 megaton bomb that was 400 times the amount of power as Hiroshima. For the people who are designing these tests, there's a tendency to think about the Bering Straits or the trust territories as being isolated, as being far removed from the centers of the United States. But Patsy Mink had a Pacific world understanding of these issues, along with others. So for example, the American Federation of Teachers in Hawaii point out this is like playing Russian roulette because the location of the Bering Straits was actually along the San Andreas Fault. And if you see this picture here, each one of these red dots represents seismic activity, represents earthquake activity. It's one of the most seismically active locations in the world. And that was actually part of the research design. US scientists wanted to see, can you tell the difference between a nuclear bomb going off versus an earthquake? But people who are very concerned pointed out that a nuclear detonation could in turn trigger an earthquake, and an earthquake could in turn trigger a tsunami. And the tsunami does not stay in one location. It reverberates throughout the Pacific. And there have been incidences of tsunamis that begin in the Northern Pacific and that impact places like Hawaii. Instead of thinking about these places as isolated and far off, to really think about these locations as being integrated across the waters and islands of the Pacific. Mink was also concerned about the spread of contamination, and she points out that it was not whether it would happen, but when it would happen. That even if you dig a very deep well into the earth, that dangerous material is going to be there for a long time, and it's very likely that there will be seepage into the waters, and that the waters are going to impact animal life, and the animal life are going to impact human beings. One of the ironies is that Mchika is actually a nature preserve. And so there's a really kind of humorous letter, bitterly humorous letter from Patsy Mink to the Department of Interior saying, is it okay to use a slingshot in a nature preserve? What about a BB gun? What about a 5 megaton bomb, right? What are the values that we are willing to overlook in order to allow for nuclear testing? And in this work, not just in Alaska, but in other locations in the Pacific, Mink was in alliance with Native activists. So if you look at where nuclear weapons are tested and where nuclear waste is stored, it's predominantly in indigenous lands. And so here you have Native Alaskans pointing out that there's a possible contamination of salmon, and that salmon was such an important source, not only of food, but it's an important cultural symbol for their people. I just want to point out this map of the Pacific and how, again, how that location is so important for the United States, even though there's a tendency to not think about it as being so important. So all these different islands in the Pacific and also in the Caribbean became part of the United States in the mid to late 19th century as the nation aspired to become a global power. And in fact, all these islands were necessary because the United States, in order to become a global power, had to become a naval power. And for the Navy to operate, there had to be way stations, there had to be military stations. And that's why Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii. That's why Guam, which is the furthest west of the United States, maybe about a third to maybe a half of the land is controlled by the US military. These are really important strategic sites for US military might and globally for the United States to be able to secure itself, to have a foothold in places like Asia and Latin America. So I'd like to wrap up by just giving you a sense of what Patsy Mink sounded like and what she advocated for. I'm going to switch screens so I can share this short video with you.
What you endure is who you are. And if you just accept and do nothing, then life goes on. But if you see it as a way for change, life doesn't have to be this unfair. It can be better. Maybe not for me, I can't change the past, but I can certainly help somebody else in the future so they don't have to go through what I
Looks like our audio stopped.
What you endure is who you are. And if you just accept and do nothing, then life goes on. But if you see it as a way for change, life doesn't have to be this unfair. It can be better. Maybe not for me, I can't change the past, but I can certainly help somebody else in the future so they don't have to go through what I did.
Patsy Mink grew up among the cane fields of Maui and made her mark on Capitol Hill as the nation's first woman of color in Congress.
Women's rights are about fundamental justice.
She was one of a kind. I'd never interacted with an Asian woman who was in the power circles, who was creating public policy and moving the women's agenda.
She had no patience for injustice, and she had no patience for intolerance.
Our whole government operates under the notion of secrecy, of not informing the people, of not honestly dealing with the issues.
She ran for President of the United States and wrote laws that overturned decades of discrimination against women in higher education and sports.
You must have, in any movement, people who are insistent and demanding. Somebody has to be your conscience to make you ashamed of yourself.
I've run many, many times, and I've lost many times, but I've never given up. A feeling that I, as an individual, and you, as an individual, can make the difference.
You're currently muted, Dr. Wu.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I understand that the document was recently screened and it's available for students if they haven't had a chance to view it. And I hope you do. I think she's incredibly inspirational. Let me just end with this concluding slide. So I've talked about bridge feminism. I've talked about intersectional legislative feminism, talked about Pacific feminism. And I just want to end with this quote, which is actually the title of the film. It's also ahead of the majority. This was a phrase that Patsy Mink used when she was running for the US Senate in 1975, 1976. And what's striking to me is that 1976 was the bicentennial of the United States. It was the 200th anniversary of the country. And every woman who ran for the Senate lost. So what does that say to us about gender equity on this particular historic occasion? But as she said in the movie, in the documentary, she's run many times and she lost many times, but she never lost the faith that she can make a difference. And I want to emphasize this quote that it really encapsulates her political philosophy, right? She says, it's easy enough to vote right and be consistent with the majority, but it is more often more important to be ahead of the majority. And this means being willing to cut the first furrow in the ground and stand alone for a while if necessary. And I think that it's such an expression of political courage, right? Because she's not going to wait for something to become popular or safe in order to advocate for it. She's going to go out and help others recognize what is needed to move forward as a society, to make sure that those who are most marginalized have a place in the nation, that their needs are being met, that opportunities are being created for them. And then she's basically challenging all of us to also have that political courage. Okay. I'm going to stop here and see if you have questions.
And I will pop back in. So everyone who was intrigued by the trailer that was shown, we do have access to the movie Patsy Mink Ahead of the Majority. We have it on Canopy. So if you are a South Texas College student, you can access that and watch it at any time. And I definitely recommend it. It's an excellent movie. She's incredibly inspirational, as you have probably guessed from Dr. Wu's amazing presentation. I haven't seen any questions come through the chat yet, but those of you who are here with us, feel free to put them either in the chat or the Q&A function, whichever you are more comfortable with. With the Q&A, your question will not show unless we tell it to. So, we can make it anonymous if you would rather not be told, we won't say your name out loud. We'll put it that way. We won't say your name out loud if you would rather ask something anonymously. That said, I did jot down a couple questions as like little icebreakers. But first of all, I am incredibly curious. Can you tell us more about her presidential campaign? Because I have seen a decent amount of media about Patsy Mink, but they never really went too terribly in depth about her presidential campaign. I'd love to know what she was like as a candidate.
Yeah, it mostly happened in the state of Oregon because they really wanted her to run for the presidency. And I think she was trying to figure out, like, okay, what's the actual level of support? Are you really going to be behind me? And because of the kind of strangeness of election law, because she ran in the state of Oregon, she was also listed, I think, in Wisconsin and maybe in Hawaii. But she actually never ran in those states. It was only in Oregon. And she talked about going up and down the state and making all these different speeches. And so she was really disappointed that there were not more votes that were garnered from her effort. But yeah, it was, 1972 was like a banner year because that was Title IX, that was Roe v. Wade, that was ERA, that was her traveling to Paris. She was also running for the presidency. So she was really like a political maverick in a lot of things that she was doing. And even the Democratic Party within her state were very skeptical of her and actually try to mobilize opposition to her because they thought that she was too out there, that she didn't kind of follow the scriptures enough within their Democratic Party. But she was someone who just kind of was willing to take political risks.
Awesome. I was going to ask too, what was the most surprising thing that you came across while you were writing this book, whether it was about Patsy or about what she dealt with growing up, or just even like something fun that just came across your radar and you went, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think I really like the period when she's away from federal office. So I mentioned that she ran for the US Senate and lost. So she was in Congress from 65 to 77. She lost, and then she came back in 1990 and 2002. And actually, she died while in office. And even after she passed away, people in Hawaii elected her again as a symbol, as a sign of that they trusted her and then wanted to honor her. But it's actually that period in between that I find really fascinating. So for a period of time, she was in the State Department under Jimmy Carter, advocating, working for environmental issues, basically, and scientific issues. She also worked for Americans for Democratic Action, which is a national organization that Eleanor Roosevelt helped found, and it was to try to offer more progressive politics for Democratic politicians. What I find most fascinating is that she actually went back to Hawaii, and I just think about her age at that time. So she was born in the kind of late 20s, and by the late 70s, she's 50. So I can relate to that age frame. And she just wasn't quite sure what she was going to do with herself politically. Like she had been in Congress. I think she had all these questions. But when she went back to Hawaii, her neighborhood was being considered as a site for a trash incinerator. And the people in the community were obviously upset because that would be a site for, smell pollution, smoke pollution. It just would not be something that would enhance the community. But it was a predominantly working class, multiracial community. And so she worked with the activists to say, okay, this is wrong. Let's see if we can try to stop the process. Let's see if we can change the minds of policymakers. And because of that, she decided to run for city council. So it's very unusual, I think, to have a federal politician at the national level run at the local level. But it just indicated how much she was passionate about these issues and that she was willing and committed to making change, regardless of, the level of involvement. So I love that insight about her.
Yeah, that's amazing to do. Like basically reading about everything that she did just exhausts me. And I'm like, I'm only 40. And she was doing this up until 2002, you said. Wow, just wow.
I guess another favorite story I have about Patsy Mink is actually she and her husband were so tight. Like they met each other, they fell in love, they bonded over bridge and politics, and they were both science majors. And he was her campaign manager. So it was like very much a family affair. They didn't actually have consultants and like things that people really go into now in order to campaign. It was very much kind of a much more grassroots local affair. And I never had a chance to meet him, but apparently he was such a lovely person. Everybody I've talked to just said he was such a wonderful person. And to have a white man married to an Asian American woman, and being her biggest supporter, I thought was just like such a wonderful dynamic. And I did an interview with someone whose daughter lived with him after Patsy Mink passed away. She just needed a place to stay and was renting a room or something like that, or staying with the family. And she said that he would go every day to her grave and just talk to her because he was just so used to having her for company. I just thought that was such a beautiful expression of love, this kind of lifelong commitment that these two people have with each other. So that's another really favorite story that I have.
That's very sweet. It's, we have all of these images of her as this politician who's out there like getting things done and doing and just go, 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 go. But then having those little moments that completely, show how human, her and her relationships and everything are. Like, she definitely was an amazing person, but she also had these very human connections with all these different people. I'm going to pick your brain a little bit here. What is your opinion on the current, I guess, wave that we're experiencing of feminism? I know Patsy went through different waves and she usually was ahead of the majority. She was, progressive, even in those kinds of spaces. But I'm curious if your research with her put anything in perspective with the challenges that women, especially women of color, are still going through in 2023. Whether either she inspired you or that, basically seeing what she went through and what she thought way back well before a lot of these concepts were mainstream. Whether that has triggered anything for you in terms of like where we stand with women's rights and gender equality and all of that in the current state of affairs.
That's a really good question. People often ask me what I think are the legacies of Patsy Mink, and certainly you can point to important legislation like Title IX. But I think what's really important to me is that she was always willing to put up the fight because even when she passed away in 2002, that was the 30th anniversary of Title IX. And I mentioned before that there were all these efforts to dilute its impact, even right after it was passed. But there were efforts repeatedly over the course of Title IX to just try to minimize it, take it away, have it as a lesser protection for women and gender equity. And so something that Patsy Mink communicated was that you just need to be constantly vigilant. Like, these legislative protections may not always be there, that you have to really fight for it. And that's part of what it means to be a good citizen, is that you are informed, you feel empowered to engage in the political process. And I think there surely have been setbacks that we've been facing collectively. But I see the, Me Too movement, it was just so powerful, all these women coming forth. And in response to, political conditions that basically said it was fine, right? It was okay to commit sexual harassment. And there was such mass mobilization to say, no, it's not okay, that we're here to tell our stories. So I think just as there's going to be ongoing efforts to resist change, I think that itself will generate and ignite people to demand change. And I think that's such a valuable political lesson to learn, that it's not, okay, we've won the fight and it's over, but it's actually—
now we can chill out. Now we can put our feet up. Yep, we're
right.
good. No, it never
Yeah,
ends.
but it's a constant battle.
Do you think the way that we implement Title IX right now is what Patsy intended? And do you think if she was still around, she would want to make changes to it?
It's so interesting because I just came from this conference on women in sports, and I'm so admirous of these women who have been athletes and coaches, and you can tell they've been doing this for decades. And they create this conference not only for themselves, but for younger athletes, including high school athletes, and just to make sure they understand that there's been a history that opens doors, and that doors are not completely open, right? That, the type of resources that are available, the opportunities, leadership, it's still not, we're not there yet. So Title IX provides that legislative mandate, but we have to be aware that the law exists, and we have to figure out how to vigorously implement it. Because I think there's ways in which it's a minimal implementation as opposed to, like a maximum implementation. So again, I think going along with this idea that we need to fight for our rights, because these social inequalities are so deeply ingrained. And it's not the fault of the individual, it's not the fault of these movements, but that there's such deeply ingrained structural forms of inequality that these are different tools that we can use to support one another and to advocate for what we think is more just.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we are approaching 7 o'clock. So I have not seen any more questions in the chat. If you want to hurry and get your question in right now, we can try to. But that said, thank you so much, Dr. Wu, for coming and presenting for us here at South Texas College. You and are also an inspiration. Just the amount of things that you do on a daily basis just to get the information out there about Patsy and about what's going on and has gone on in the past for women's rights and all of that. It's amazing. Thank you again so much. You are a fantastic speaker for us to have here for Women's History Month.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I was just going to share a few things that I think might be fun and hopefully inspirational. Last March, this time, Speaker Pelosi hosted an event that honored Patsy Mink and Billie Jean King. And it was just so much fun to be in the US Capitol, to recognize these two incredible women. And then last June, as part of the 50th anniversary of Title IX, there was an unveiling of a portrait of Patsy Mink that's now placed, I believe, in proximity to Shirley Chisholm. And it was just so wonderful to see the aides of the legislators. A lot of them are younger women. A lot of them are women of color, and they were just so excited to have their picture taken with Patsy Mink's portrait. You can see how they directly inspired them, how she directly inspired them. And then this year, there's going to be a Patsy Mink quarter. So
cool.
I'm looking forward to that.
I'm going to be checking all of my quarters now. That is wonderful. Thank you again so much, Dr. Wu. And thank you to everyone who came out. I'm going to be putting a link in our chat. It goes to a survey. If you would fill that out and let us know what you thought of this event and so we can make decisions about ones to come. I would really, really appreciate that. And if you cannot do so right now, or you close out of it by accident, anything like that, you will get an email tomorrow thanking you for attending with another link to it, because I am nothing if not persistent about getting those numbers. But thank you again, Dr. Wu. Thank you to the Organization of American Historians. This was a wonderful presentation, and I can see why you are a distinguished speaker.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone again for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.